In this video, we will be fixing the rattle at startup issue in this 2003 Toyota Camry. At startup, we have a quick rattle, which quits after about 1 second. This process will be completed in a garage, and the vehicle has been parked so that the passenger side front is accessible. We have jacked it up and supported the vehicle with safety stands. We have set the parking brake. We have wheel chocks underneath the rear tires, and we have also drained the oil. And we can begin by disconnecting the negative battery terminal, covering that and setting that out of the way. We can then remove our plastic trim cover piece. This is held on by two 10mm fasteners. And we can pull that up and work it off of the two studs holding it in place. We then have two air lines that we need to remove from the valve cover. These are part of the positive crankcase ventilation system, or the PCV system. These are held on by two spring clamps. We can then take a look at our bundle of wires running over the valve cover, and I'm going to be working from the valve cover forwards, removing each connection point. So starting with the top of the valve cover, I do have a 10mm fastener. Following that down, I have a blue connector and a gray wiring harness just above the alternator. Pressing the tab on the bottom, we can remove that first connector and also that blue retaining connector. And we have 2 points on the alternator, one of which is a 10mm nut. Following it down further again, we have a retaining clip mounted to our AC compressor. We have another wiring harness. If we continue following that wiring loom down into the engine, we can see that we have an additional connection. This is just a small plastic clip. That chunk of wires then gets terminated at the end of the line with one more wiring harness. This one goes to your oxygen sensor located underneath the vehicle. And at that termination point of that entire wiring harness, we do have one 10mm bolt holding that bracket in place. And that should give us the ability to move that entire wiring loom out of the way. We can then remove our ground wire. There are two 10mm fasteners holding this in. Our 4 ignition coils can come next. These are all held in by a wiring harness and one 10mm bolt. We now have better access to our valve cover. Taking a look at the diagram, around the perimeter we have 8 fasteners and 2 in the center. Each of those fasteners are 10mm. Some of them are nuts and some of them are bolts. Plus an 11th one that was holding down our bundle of wires going to our ignition coils. Our 2 longest bolts went in the middle. The 6 bolts that are the same size go around the perimeter, and also 2 nuts around the perimeter where we have studs coming through, and that one additional short one is what connected to the far end of the valve cover holding that wiring harness down. We should be able to very gently work that valve cover off. And with that valve cover off, we can see our reason for the repair, which is the VVT Sprocket, which is what causes the 1 second rattle at the startup. To prep for this next phase, we are going to remove the wheel And taking a look into the wheel well, we do have a small plastic shroud that we need to remove. Visibly, we can see two 10mm fasteners. And that one hidden fastener did have a button retainer where you pop out the center and pull the clip out. I couldn't see that, so I did end up breaking that little plastic cap, so we'll have to get another one of those. We can then remove the serpentine belt. If we look through the wheel well and find our crankshaft pulley, we can see that towards the top of it there is a small indicator. This helps us determine top dead center. If we look at the side of that crankshaft pulley, we can see a little notch. This notch needs to line up with our 0 indicator mark. So we are going to rotate that crankshaft pulley clockwise until that small notch lines up with the 0 indicator mark. Now we do have a couple things to point out. We do have a timing mark on our VVT Sprocket, and we also have a timing mark on our camshaft sprocket. If we look behind each of those, we should have a corresponding timing mark. And we can see that VVT Sprocket and camshaft sprocket timing marks are lined up. Now what I do not see is my identified chain link that helps me make sure everything is timed correctly. So I am going to rotate the crankshaft 1 full revolution, check this again. If I don't see those indicator marks, I'm going to go another full rotation and then check it again. And to verify again, I have my timing mark. That corresponds to my timing mark. I have my other timing mark. That corresponds to my other timing mark. And it is worth noting that our identified chain links are off by about 1 link on both of these. And at this point, we're going to remove that crankshaft pulley. And we can gently wiggle that pulley off. Next component to remove is the torque rod located on top of the engine. This will have 3 14mm bolts. And we can remove that bracket that our torque rod unit was mounted to. There are 5 14mm bolts, one of which we do not need to remove. If we take a look to the right side of the exhaust manifold down into the engine, we can see one 17mm bolt on our motor mount. And to aid in being able to move the engine up and down, I am going to remove the axle nut. This will give me just a little bit more flexibility. And this is a 30mm nut. We then want to locate our motor mount on the passenger side. The top of that has a 19mm nut. To jack up the engine, I have placed a couple rubber blocks on top of my jack, and I have those positioned just behind the oil pan. This way we are not jacking it up directly on the oil pan. And we are actually jacking this up by the bracket that is mounted to the engine that our axle runs through. This does give me plenty of flexibility. and I'm not worried about crushing that oil pan. And with that engine raised slightly, I'm going to switch my focus back to the top of the engine, and I'm going to locate my water pump pulley. And with 2 wrenches opposing themselves, I can loosen up my first bolt. So we got 3 of those loose, and we can loosen a couple of those up part way to get a screwdriver in there and use that screwdriver as leverage for the last one. And then we can shift focus to the tensioner itself. We have 1 bolt that is pretty clearly visible just to the left of that tensioner pulley, and that one is a 14mm bolt. And that tensioner is held on by 1 additional fastener. And then we can remove the bracket for our motor mount. And we can then shift focus to the power steering pump. And behind that power steering pump, we can see 2 14mm bolts. We can rotate the pulley till one of our holes lines up with our bolt and work on a socket. And I am going to lower the engine down just slightly to get that last bolt out. And we should be able to work that power steering pump off. And this might require wiggling it back and forth to work that loose. Taking a look at our wheel well, we do want to locate the oil pan next. Specifically on the oil pan, we are taking a look at the front edge of it. And on that front edge, we have a series of 4 fasteners that we need to remove. These are 10mm fasteners. And if we take a look at those 4 fasteners, this is as if you were looking from the wheel well. We have a nut that is 10mm, 2 10mm bolts, and we have an additional 10mm bolt that has an inverted Torx head on the end of it. And at this point, we are ready to remove the timing chain cover. We have a series of 14 bolts and 2 nuts around the outside of this timing chain cover. We should be able to access about 6 of them from underneath, and the rest we should be able to get from up above. And so we will just slowly work through, making sure to identify the location of each bolt, just in case the bolts are different sizes or lengths, etc. And on the top right and left, we do have these inverted Torx. These are E5s. And to help things go just a little bit smoother, I did create a worksheet and taped it to a cardboard box, which allowed me to place each bolt in the correct location as I removed it. A link to this worksheet is in the video description. On the back side of the timing chain cover, we have a timing chain tensioner, and on the front side, down towards the bottom of our timing chain cover, we have a crankshaft position sensor. We will take a look at this one first. And if we take a look at that, we can see one 10mm fastener holding that in place. At this point, we should be ready to remove our timing chain cover. I am going to give it a few light taps with a soft face hammer to hopefully loosen it up a little bit. And then I am going to gently pry from the bottom left corner to see if this will come off. Now it is worth noting that if you did not remove the E5 stud that goes through the oil pan, the pry method will not work because you're just pushing against that stud. Taking a look behind the chain cover, we can see our chain tensioner slipper on the left, and we can see our timing chain guide on the right. And on that slipper, we have one 12mm bolt at the bottom. And on that chain tensioner guide, we have one 10mm bolt at the bottom. And we are supposed to have one at the top also. This one was found loose inside of here. And we can remove those bolts and then work those components out of the engine and off of that timing chain. Taking a look back towards the bottom, we have our crank angle sensor plate that we can work off. This is keyed and labeled with an F. And then we can see that timing mark on our crankshaft timing sprocket. Again, our indicated link is one link off, which corresponds to above with it being one link off. And we can go ahead and remove that timing chain. And we also have that crankshaft timing sprocket we can remove. And this one is keyed also. We will then be removing our camshaft timing sprocket. We are first going to place an adjustable wrench on the camshaft. This will help hold it in place while we are loosening our bolt. And this then is a 14mm. And this is also keyed. That key is in line with the timing mark. And that same procedure will be followed on the other side with our VVT Sprocket or valve timing controller assembly. And that also has a key to help us set up our timing. Taking a look underneath, we will be focusing on our oil pump drive shaft sprocket, as well as our oil pump drive sprocket. We will need to rotate the engine 90 degrees counterclockwise so that our open hole lines up with a corresponding open hole behind it. I am using a 14mm socket to rotate the sprocket. And I am using a 5/64 steel punch. This is also right at 4 millimeters in diameter. And then we can work that nut off. And a 10 millimeter fastener for our chain tensioner. At this point, we should have everything removed and we should be able to proceed with reassembly. One thing I did notice is that the water pump appears to have a piece of belt stuck in it. And given that we have plenty of access, we're going to go ahead and just replace the water pump as well. I also noticed that I had some debris fall into the bottom of the oil pan. So we're going to go ahead and remove the oil pan and replace this also. This will also give us an opportunity to inspect the pan and the components inside of the pan. Now in total, that oil pan does have a series of 14 fasteners, and in the Toyota instructions, they do want you to remove the entire pan for this procedure. Just something to keep in mind. And if we take a look underneath the vehicle at the oil pan, we do see a series of fasteners. All of these fasteners are easily accessible, which will make this repair just a little bit easier. And even though I did drain all of the oil out of this before starting this repair, you can see how much oil has accumulated from dripping off of the engine, as well as oil that just does not get evacuated from the system. So we're basically looking at about a half a quart of oil left in the system. And as I was doing this, I did notice some debris in the bottom of the pan. It is possible this is just old gasket material that has got crusty and broke off when I pulled the pan. And we do have some metallic specks in the bottom as well. To remove the water pump, we first need to gain access to it as it is sitting behind the alternator. We have one 14 millimeter fastener that is pretty easily accessible. And then we have a 12 millimeter fastener that is a little bit harder to get to underneath. And we should be able to pivot that out. Our system currently has coolant in it. We need to drain that down far enough that we're not going to make a mess when we pull off the water pump. This begins with removing our shroud under the front of the car. Taking a look up underneath, we can see our petcock. This will allow us to drain down our cooling system. For a more controlled evacuation, we can hook up a length of tubing and open that valve into our collection bucket. And since this is a sealed system, removing the radiator cap will introduce air that will allow it to flow easier. On the water pump, we have a series of 6 fasteners around the perimeter of the pump. These are 10 millimeter fasteners. And we can remove that wiring harness as well. And we'll see if we can loosen that up with a soft face hammer. And you will want to have a drip pan underneath to catch any residual fluid. And we can stick a rag in there while we prep this for our new one. And we can then use a plastic scraper to clean off the old gasket material and any buildup. And while I'm at it, I will just continue right around to the mating surface for my timing chain cover. And with the bulk of the material scraped off, we can come back with some acetone and clean this up really nice. And while we are replacing parts, we might as well replace the thermostat. So we want to locate the thermostat housing, which is right next to where our water pump was. And we do have two 10mm fasteners, one on top and one on bottom. And to gain better access to the one on the bottom, I am going to remove my radiator hose. And using some pliers, we can work that thermostat out if it is stuck. Taking a look at our new thermostat, it is slightly different. And our new one does not have a gasket, so we will transfer that gasket over and check to make sure that it is in good condition. And the jiggle valve needs to be positioned straight up in the engine, just something to be aware of. And we can then reinstall our housing. And both of these bolts will be torqued to 80 inch-pounds. And we can reconnect that lower radiator hose. We can then compare our new water pump with our old water pump just to verify that everything looks the same. And to seal this to the engine, we are using Permatex water pump and thermostat housing gasket maker. We will be applying a continuous bead of silicone to the water pump surface, and we are going to surround each of the bolt hole locations. We will assemble the parts immediately while the silicone is still wet, and we're going to finger tighten each of the bolts until the silicone begins to squeeze out slightly. We're going to let that dry for 1 hour, and then we're going to tighten it to our torque specifications. Now, if you remember, I did have a wiring harness bracket on 2 of these bolts, so we will go get that set up. And for that crankshaft position sensor, we can compare our old part with our new part. The only difference is the metal bracket that goes on the water pump, and we have an additional small bracket that goes on the wiring harness end. So we'll go ahead and put that in place on our vehicle. And we will wait that 1 hour before torquing these down. And at this point, it has been sitting for 1 hour. We're going to jump around as we tighten these, and we are torquing them down to 80 inch-pounds. And I do have a very small bit that squeezed out where my timing chain cover is going to go. Once this sets up fully, I will cut that off just so it doesn't get in the way. And we will do a little bit of wrap up on the cooling end of it. This includes reinstalling the radiator cap, removing the hose, and tightening the petcock. And I will leave off my lower shrouds and the alternator, which should give me just a little bit more access. And we will also leave the oil pan till the end, as all of those bolts are accessible, and I don't want anything accidentally falling in there. And back to our crankshaft position sensor, we will move that other small metal bracket. And at this point, we will be setting up our oil pump drive chain with our oil pump drive sprocket, as well as our oil pump drive shaft sprocket. A couple things worth noting. Our oil pump drive shaft sprocket does have a flat portion on it. And we can also see that our timing mark is aligned with our identified link. And on the oil pump drive sprocket, we have a keyway. We can also see that timing mark, and we have aligned that with our identified link. And we can gently work that unit into place, making sure that it is fully seated. And I'm going to loosely add that 14mm nut. After that, I have my chain tensioner. And we do have that small spring that we want to get positioned correctly. And we can then install that on the vehicle. And this is a 10mm fastener. That chain tensioner does get torqued to 9 foot-pounds. We can then reinstall our punch, and this will be torqued to 22 foot-pounds. And then we will rotate this back 90 degrees to its original position. We can then shift focus to our VVT Sprocket. And prior to installation, I am going to put just a little bit of oil on this. And when installing this, we do want our timing mark to line up with our timing mark on the engine. And we can install that bolt. This is a 14mm bolt. It is tightened to 40 foot-pounds, and we do want to hang on to the adjustable wrench so we are not rotating components within the engine. After that, we have our camshaft timing sprocket. And this is also tightened to 40 foot-pounds, and you will want to move that adjustable wrench. Our timing chain and crankshaft timing sprocket come next. And we do have that one timing mark that needs to align with our identified chain link. And before installing this, you do want to verify the timing marks line up on the VVT sprocket as well as the camshaft sprocket. It is also worth noting there is a little bit of spring back, so these timing marks will be close, but they will be just slightly off because of that spring back tension. And we then have our chain guide. And as I inspect the top bolt, I can see that the threads are damaged. This was the bolt that was just sitting inside of there when I disassembled it. This has a thread pitch of 1.0. This would be a metric 6 by 1.0. And we'll check that out and see if that one works. And that one does thread in really nice now. Both of these bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom, get tightened to 80 inch-pounds. We then have our slipper. This will be torqued to 14 foot-pounds once it is seated and installed. And to make sure that this fits properly, I am going to ever so slightly rotate the camshaft back against that spring pressure as I position this in place. We can then install our crank angle sensor plate with the F marked forward. At this point, we are going to be prepping our timing cover for reinstallation. And we will begin by removing the chain tensioner. This has two 10mm bolts. And we do have a gasket on that. And we will come back with some acetone and clean up those mating surfaces. And using a hammer and standard head screwdriver, we can tap out the old seal. And we can tap our new one in place. And we do want that flush with the outside. And we'll apply just a little bit of oil to that new seal. And I do like to test fit this prior to installation just to see what might be hitting. And essentially I am just practicing to make sure that it goes smoothly and I don't bump that gasket material against something. Now I was getting caught up on this wiring harness. There is an additional 10mm bolt on the back side of this that is very difficult to see. This does allow me to move that wiring harness out of the way a little bit more. And we will clean both surfaces one more time with acetone. We will be using Permatex Ultra Black gasket maker. And similar to the water pump, we will apply a bead of silicone around the entire surface and each bolt hole. And don't forget the locations in the middle. And our engine block, any location where we have a seam, we want an additional small glob of sealant. And there will be 4 different locations for that. We can then very gently work that in place and finger tighten each bolt until it squeezes out just a little bit. We will then wait an hour and then tighten it down to our torque specifications. And I went ahead and updated the worksheet to include the torque specs as well. I figured that would be helpful. The crankshaft position sensor can then be installed next, and that is held on with one 10mm bolt. And I do like to put a little bit of oil on the O-ring prior to putting that in. And we can put that wire back in that harness that is mounted onto the water pump. And one additional 10mm bolt. Our next goal is to work the power steering pump back on. This was probably the most difficult part of the job. It did take me about 2 hours to get this positioned correctly. The bolts are very long. You have to raise and lower the engine, and the bracket has to have the bolts threaded into it on the back side. We can see the 2 threaded locations. There is a bracket on the front side, and the power steering pump has to fit in there very tightly. After that, we have our motor mount bracket. Next, we have our belt tensioner. We will be switching this out with a new one because the originals do tend to break over time. And then we have our water pump pulley. And since we switched out the water pump, we went ahead and switched out the pulley for a new one also. We can then lower the engine and install our nut for the motor mount on the passenger side. And our motor mount on the front, we have a 17mm bolt. And we will tighten up that axle nut on the passenger side. And at this point, I think we are ready to reinstall the oil pan. We are switching this oil pan out for a new one. And similar to the timing chain cover, we will be using Permatex Ultra Black gasket maker around the perimeter, as well as each bolt hole. And we will want to scrape any gasket material off prior to installing our new oil pan. And a little acetone to clean that up. And although I did get this to work, I would recommend installing the pan prior to lowering the engine and reattaching the motor mount bolts. Like I said, I did get this to work, but it was quite the puzzle to fit it in there. And we then want to finger tighten each bolt and let that sit for 1 hour before coming back and torquing this down. And each of these are 78 inch-pounds. We can then start working with our chain tensioner. We do want the small ear to be facing back and up. And installing this was the second most difficult part of the job. There basically is not enough room with this wiring harness where that tensioner hits on it. I'm sure there is a bolt that would allow you to move that wiring harness further. And we can install our crankshaft pulley next. This gets torqued to 125 foot-pounds. And after that is torqued, we are going to slightly rotate this counterclockwise and then slightly rotate it clockwise. This will set the chain tensioner. And we are going to end back on our 0 mark. And we have a couple more bolts for our wiring harness that is covering up that chain tensioner. We can get the alternator put in next. And we can then install the serpentine belt, followed by our torque rod unit. And I like to coat the chain with a little bit of oil before we install that valve cover. And we'll switch out that valve cover gasket, making sure we clean the mating surfaces before applying that new gasket. And a little extra sealant will be added to the seam location on the engine. This will be done in 2 locations. And the valve cover comes next with each of the fasteners. Then we can install our ignition coils. Followed by that ground wire. And then we have our long wiring loom that runs over the top of the valve cover, beginning with a 10mm fastener on top of the valve cover. We have one connector for our crank position sensor, and then we have a blue retaining clip, 2 points of connection for our alternator. Then we have a plastic clip a little bit further down, followed by our wiring harness for the AC compressor. Another plastic clip further down, and then we have our O2 sensor connection with that 10mm bolt and bracket. And 2 PCV system hoses, followed by our plastic trim cover piece. Other jobs I need to do is reinstall the splash guard in the wheel well and reinstall the tire. Now I'm not going to fill this up with oil or coolant just yet because I do need to wait 24 hours for that gasket material to fully cure. It has now been 24 hours and we are ready to top off our cooling system. And we will add just over 4 quarts of oil. And I did change the filter also. You will want to check the oil and top off as necessary. Also, purging the air out of the cooling system is recommended. Additionally, I will give the engine a few heat cycles prior to taking this for a test drive.